I put my head down and cried for the first time since my wife's funeral, all because an HOA president wanted to destroy the last piece of her I had left. 6 months after losing my wife Margaret to cancer, I planted tomatoes in my backyard using the seeds we'd saved together, and it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. Then Linda Patterson, the president of our homeowners association, showed up demanding I rip out every plant or pay $100 weekly fines because my garden was unsightly. As I stared at that violation notice, something snapped inside me. What I discovered next would expose years of systematic abuse. This HOA president had been bankrupting families with illegal fines, forcing elderly couples to abandon their dying memorial trees, and even trying to steal a dementia patient's therapy. Dog. My revenge would be so devastating that within 1 week, she'd be forced to flee town in complete disgrace. My name is Frank Dalton, and I was 67 years old when I moved into Meadowbrook Estates, carrying nothing but 2 suitcases and a heart full of grief that felt heavy enough to crush me. My wife Margaret had passed away 6 months earlier after a devastating battle with cancer that lasted 43 years of marriage, and our old house on Elm Street had become too full of memories to bear. Every room held echoes of her laughter. Every corner reminded me of conversations we'd never have again. I'd wake up in the middle of the night reaching for her side of the bed, only to find cold sheets and the crushing weight of loneliness. The small ranch-style home on Willow Lane seemed perfect for starting over. Quiet, affordable, and surrounded by the kind of well-maintained lawns that reminded me of the suburban dreams Margaret and I had shared when we were young and believed we'd have forever together. I had worked as a maintenance supervisor at Lincoln High School for 35 years before retiring, the kind of steady job that built a good life 1 paycheck at a time. I was the kind of man who fixed things with his hands. Broken desks that had been falling apart for years, leaky faucets that drove teachers crazy, stubborn boilers that refused to heat the building during brutal winter months. My hands were scarred from decades of honest work, calloused and weathered like old leather, and my back ached something fierce on rainy days when the arthritis flared up. But I took deep pride in solving problems that left other people scratching their heads and calling expensive repair services. Teachers would come to me with that desperate look in their eyes. The copy machine was eating papers again, jamming every 3rd page and making sounds like a dying animal, or the classroom door wouldn't lock properly and they were worried about security, or the radiator in room 204 was making sounds like a freight train and scaring the elementary kids during story time. I would just smile that patient smile Margaret had fallen in love with all those years ago and say I'd take care of it. And I always did. Usually with simple solutions that made the teachers wonder why they'd been worried about such an easy fix. I had that rare combination of mechanical intuition and stubborn persistence that made me invaluable to 3 different principals over the decades. After Margaret died of the cancer that ate through her like wildfire despite all the treatments and all the hope we'd poured into fighting it together, those same weathered hands had planted a small vegetable garden behind our old house on Elm Street. I'd tend the tomatoes and peppers with the same careful attention I'd once given to fixing broken things at school, watering them every morning at sunrise and talking to them the way Margaret used to do, telling them about the weather and my plans for the day and how much I missed her voice in the quiet house. She'd taught me to garden during our first year of marriage, back when we were poor and young and madly in love, patient and gentle as she showed me how to test soil between my fingers and space plants so they wouldn't crowd each other. "Plants are like people, Frank," she'd say, her hands dirty from working in the soil and her face glowing with happiness as she knelt beside me in our first tiny garden plot. "Give them room to grow, and they'll surprise you with what they can do. Crowd them together and try to control every little thing, and they'll never reach their potential." Those words had stuck with me through 4 decades of marriage, and I'd thought about them often during my years working at the school, watching teenagers struggle and bloom when given the right combination of guidance and freedom. That little garden was the only thing that kept me from falling apart completely during those first terrible months without her. The only activity that felt like she was still there beside me, still teaching me about life and growth and patience. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late May, one of those perfect spring days when the air smelled like fresh grass and blooming flowers and infinite possibility. The temperature was in the low 70s with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of honeysuckle, the kind of morning that made you grateful to be alive. I was kneeling in my new backyard, carefully transplanting tomato seedlings I'd started from seed back in March in my garage, nurturing them under grow lights through the last cold weeks of winter. These were the same variety Margaret had always loved, Cherokee purples that would turn deep burgundy black when ripe and taste like summer itself, sweet and complex with a flavor that store-bought tomatoes could never match. My knees protested against the hard ground, creaking like old hinges that needed oil, but I didn't mind the discomfort. This was meditation for me, this connection to the earth that Margaret had shown me all those years ago, this simple act of placing seeds in soil and trusting in the ancient magic of growth and renewal. I was carefully placing the third seedling into its prepared hole, making sure the roots had plenty of room to spread, when I heard the sharp click of high heels on concrete, purposeful and aggressive like a soldier marching to war. I looked up from my work to see a woman walking toward me with the kind of stride that said she owned not just the ground she walked on, but everything around it for miles in every direction. Even from a distance of 30 yards, I could tell this wasn't going to be a friendly neighbor stopping by with a casserole and a warm welcome to the neighborhood. Linda Patterson was exactly the kind of person I had hoped never to encounter again. The kind who seemed to make life difficult for others just because they had the power to do so and enjoyed the feeling of control it gave them. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall but carried herself like she was 6 feet. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair sprayed into an immovable helmet that probably wouldn't move in a hurricane. Not a single strand was out of place, and I had the strange thought that she probably slept sitting upright to avoid messing up her elaborate hairstyle. She wore a crisp white blazer over navy blue pants that looked like they cost more than my monthly pension check, every line perfectly pressed and every detail carefully coordinated to project an image of authority and success. Her pale blue eyes had the cold, calculating look of someone who'd never met a rule she didn't want to enforce or a person she couldn't find fault with, scanning my property like a general surveying a battlefield. Everything about her screamed authority and control, from the way she held her shoulders back like she was perpetually standing at military attention to the official-looking clipboard she clutched like a weapon ready to be deployed against anyone who dared to cross her. Her fingernails were perfectly manicured in a shade of red that looked expensive and aggressive. Her white leather shoes were spotless despite walking across grass, and they made little divots in my carefully maintained lawn with each purposeful step. She moved like someone who'd never been told no in her life, or at least not recently, someone who expected immediate compliance and couldn't fathom the possibility that anyone would dare to challenge her authority. There was something in her expression that reminded me of the worst kind of administrator I'd dealt with at school, the ones who cared more about policies and procedures than about the actual people those policies were supposed to serve. "Excuse me," Linda said when she reached the edge of my carefully planned garden plot, her voice carrying that particular tone of fake politeness that fooled absolutely no one who'd lived long enough to recognize authentic courtesy. It was the kind of voice people used when they were about to ruin your day but wanted to pretend they were doing you a favor. "I'm Linda Patterson, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Are you the new resident at 247 Willow Lane?" I wiped my dirty hands on my old blue jeans and stood up slowly, my knees creaking and popping like old floorboards in a house that had seen too many seasons. I was tall and lean, weathered by years of physical work and honest labor, with silver hair that stubbornly refused to stay combed no matter how much pomade I used, and laugh lines around my eyes that hadn't had much to smile about lately. My face bore the kind of deep tan that came from decades of working outdoors. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Frank Dalton. Nice to meet you." Linda's smile was as thin as paper and about as warm as a January morning in Minnesota, the kind of expression that never reached her eyes and seemed calculated to intimidate rather than welcome. Her teeth were perfect and white, probably professionally maintained, and I wondered if she practiced that particular expression in the mirror each morning. "Mr. Dalton, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about your landscaping choices. According to our HOA bylaws, specifically Section 4.7, subsection C, vegetable gardens are strictly prohibited in any visible areas of residential properties. Your garden here represents a clear violation of our established community standards." I felt my stomach drop like I'd just stepped off a cliff and was falling through empty air toward jagged rocks below. I looked down at my small plot of earth. maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, about the size of a large area rug, where I'd so carefully and lovingly planted 6 tomato plants, some pepper seedlings that would eventually produce sweet bells and spicy, jalapenos, and a few herbs that Margaret had always said were essential for good cooking, basil and oregano and thyme. It was neat as a pin, well mulched with straw I'd bought at the garden center, and surrounded by a small border of marigolds that Margaret had always loved because they kept harmful insects away while adding cheerful color. Visible areas? Ma'am, this is my backyard. It's not like I planted it in the front yard where everyone driving by can see it from the street. Which is clearly visible from the Henderson's second-floor bathroom window, Linda replied, consulting her clipboard with the kind of theatrical precision that suggested she'd practiced this conversation multiple times. Our community has certain aesthetic standards to maintain, Mr. Dalton. These standards exist to protect property values and ensure that Meadowbrook Estates remains an attractive, desirable place to live for families who've invested their life savings in these homes. Vegetable gardens are considered unsightly and negatively impact the visual appeal of our neighborhood. I looked at my tiny garden again, trying to see what could possibly be unsightly about it. The plants were healthy and green, their leaves spreading toward the morning sun. The soil was dark and rich and carefully tended, and I'd even put down landscape fabric to keep the weeds at bay. It looked better than half the flower beds I'd seen around the neighborhood, certainly better than the neglected patches of brown grass I'd noticed at several houses during my evening walks. Ma'am, with all due respect, this is barely bigger than a flower bed. It's neat and tidy, and it's not hurting anyone or bothering any neighbors. I can't see how 6 tomato plants could possibly affect property values. Linda's expression hardened like concrete setting in the summer heat, and I caught a glimpse of the real person beneath the polished exterior. Someone who didn't like being questioned or contradicted, someone who'd built her entire identity around being in control. Her jaw tightened and her eyes narrowed. Mr. Dalton, I understand you're new to our community, but rules are rules for a very important reason. They exist to maintain the character and value of our neighborhood. You have 7 calendar days to remove the garden completely, or you'll face an initial fine of $50. If you fail to comply after 30 days, the fine increases to $100 per week until the violation is corrected. These penalties are outlined clearly in your homeowner's agreement. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest, like a stone had lodged itself between my ribs and was pressing against my lungs. After Margaret died, that garden had been my lifeline, the one thing that got me out of bed each morning when the grief threatened to keep me under the covers forever, the one activity that gave me a reason to care about tomorrow when today felt unbearable. It connected me to the life we'd built together, to the rhythm of seasons and growth that had sustained us through 43 years of marriage. She'd taught me to garden with such patience, showing me how to read the soil and understand what plants needed. Some of my happiest memories were of us working side by side in our old garden, her hands guiding mine as we planted seeds and dreamed about the harvest to come. Ma'am, can't we work something out here? Maybe I could put up a small fence around it or plant some shrubs to screen it from view. I'd be happy to compromise and find a solution that works for everyone. The bylaws are quite clear on this matter, Linda said, her voice growing sharper with each word, like a knife being honed on a whetstone. No vegetables of any kind. Period. Decorative plants only. Flowers, shrubs, trees, those are acceptable because they enhance the visual appeal of the neighborhood, but not vegetables. If you're interested in appropriate landscaping options that comply with our standards, I suggest you visit Meadowbrook Garden Center on Route 9. They have a wonderful selection of plants that would be much more suitable for your situation. As Linda turned to leave, her heels clicking decisively on the concrete path like a judge's gavel announcing a final verdict, I called after her with the kind of desperation that comes from watching something precious slip away through your fingers. What about the Johnsons on Maple Street? They've got a herb garden right there by their front door, plain as day where everyone can see it. How come they're allowed to have herbs, but I can't have tomatoes? Linda paused and turned back, and the smile she gave me was pure ice, the kind that forms on windows during the coldest winter nights when the temperature drops below 0. Her expression was triumphant, like she'd been waiting for exactly this question. The Johnsons have been valued, contributing members of this community for 15 years, Mr. Dalton. Their herb garden was installed and grandfathered in before the current regulations took effect. They've also served on multiple committees and have consistently demonstrated their commitment to our community standards through years of volunteer service. Your situation is quite different, as I'm sure you can understand. The dismissal in her voice was complete and final, like a judge delivering a sentence that couldn't be appealed. I watched her walk away, her white shoes leaving little marks in my carefully maintained grass, and felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with the garden and everything to do with dignity and the basic human right to find comfort during dark times. That night, I sat alone in my empty kitchen staring at the official violation notice Linda had left tucked under my front door like a death warrant waiting to be discovered. The paper was crisp and formal, printed on expensive HOA letterhead with official seals and signatures, but the message was simple and brutal: conform or pay the consequences. The language was cold and impersonal, full of legal terms and references to sections and subsections. But what it really said was that some stranger had the power to tell me what I could do in my own backyard. I thought about Margaret, about how her whole face would light up when we'd harvest our first tomatoes each summer, how she'd hold them up to the light streaming through the kitchen window and declare them the most beautiful things she'd ever seen. She'd spend hours in our kitchen making her famous salsa, filling jar after jar with the taste of summer itself, giving them away to neighbors and friends because she believed that good food was meant to be shared. The smell of fresh basil and ripe tomatoes would fill the house for days, and for those moments everything felt perfect and right with the world. Now, some woman with perfect hair and cold eyes was telling me I couldn't even grow a few plants in my own backyard, that my grief and my memories were somehow unacceptable. The loneliness I'd been fighting for months crashed over me like a tsunami. And for the first time since Margaret's funeral, I put my head down on my kitchen table and cried like my heart was breaking all over again. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly as I stared out the window at my garden and wondered if I'd have to destroy the one thing that brought me peace. I'd barely slept, tossing and turning in my too-big bed, replaying the conversation with Linda Patterson over and over in my mind. But by the time I'd had my second cup of coffee, Margaret had always said I was useless before my second cup, I had made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I wasn't going to roll over and let some power-hungry neighbor bully me out of the one thing that brought me peace and connected me to my late wife's memory. I'd spent 35 years dealing with bureaucrats and petty tyrants in the school system, learning how to navigate administrative politics and stand up to people who confused authority with righteousness. I'd learned that the best way to fight these people was with their own weapons: rules, regulations, documentation, and the kind of patient persistence that eventually wore down even the most stubborn opponents. I spent that entire day becoming an expert on homeowner association law, diving into legal databases and state regulations with the determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. I drove to the county courthouse and researched property records, spending hours poring over dusty files and legal documents. I called the real estate agent who'd sold me the house, a friendly woman named Sarah who seemed genuinely surprised and concerned to hear about the garden restriction. I read through my property deed with a magnifying glass, looking for any mention of vegetable garden prohibitions. I even called my son Michael in Portland, a lawyer who was outraged by what he heard and offered to do research on HOA overreach cases. What I discovered made my blood pressure spike in ways my doctor would not have approved of. The current HOA bylaws had been significantly amended just 2 years ago, long after I had signed my purchase agreement. The original restrictions from when Meadowbrook Estates was first developed had been much more reasonable. They prohibited commercial agriculture and required that gardens be maintained in good condition, but they didn't ban vegetables entirely. More importantly, the changes had been pushed through by Linda Patterson herself, part of what she called her Community Beautification Initiative. I learned through my research that Linda had moved to Meadowbrook Estates 5 years earlier, fresh, from a bitter and very public divorce that had apparently left her with a substantial settlement and a serious chip on her shoulder about control and authority. Her ex-husband had been some kind of corporate executive who'd cheated on her with his secretary, the kind of betrayal that left deep scars. She'd been elected HOA president after running unopposed in an election where only 23 people out of 68 households had bothered to vote. Her campaign had focused on maintaining property values and elevating community standards, which sounded reasonable enough on paper, but in practice seemed to mean imposing her personal vision of suburban perfection on everyone else. The more I dug into Linda's background and her systematic transformation of the HOA, the angrier I got. Linda hadn't just changed the garden rules. She'd systematically rewritten dozens of regulations to give herself more power and fewer restrictions on what she could enforce. She'd increased the fines from reasonable amounts to punitive levels designed to force compliance. She'd expanded the definition of violations to include subjective judgments about aesthetic appeal that gave her unlimited power to fine anyone whose choices she personally disliked. Over the next few days, I quietly began talking to my neighbors, going door to door with the patient persistence of someone conducting a thorough investigation. The picture that emerged was deeply troubling and far worse than I had initially suspected. Linda Patterson had turned Meadowbrook Estates into a place where people were genuinely afraid to live their own lives, where residents walked on eggshells and constantly worried about attracting her attention. The stories people told me were both heartbreaking and infuriating. The Garcias, a sweet young couple with two small children named Sophia and Miguel, had been fined $300 for installing a small above-ground pool in their backyard during the previous summer. Linda claimed it was aesthetically displeasing and not in keeping with community standards, even though you could barely see it from the street and it was tucked away behind their house where it bothered no one. They'd spent most of their savings on that pool after their air conditioning had broken during a brutal heat wave, wanting to give their kids somewhere safe to play and cool off. Linda's fine had forced them to take out a high-interest loan just to pay the penalty. "She came by 3 times to measure it and take pictures," Maria Garcia told me, her voice shaking with frustration. 3 times! Like she was building a legal case against us for wanting our children to have somewhere to swim during the summer. The Chens, an elderly couple who'd lived in the neighborhood for over a decade and had always been model residents, had been forced to remove a beautiful flowering cherry tree from their front yard because Linda declared it messy when the delicate pink petals fell on the sidewalk each spring. That tree had been planted 8 years earlier to commemorate their late son David, killed by an IED in Afghanistan while serving with the Army Rangers. They'd tended it lovingly every year, watching it bloom each spring as a living reminder of their boy's life and sacrifice. When Linda ordered it removed, Mrs. Chen had cried for days, telling her husband it felt like losing David all over again. The tree removal company had charged them $400 to cut down something that had brought them comfort and honored their son's memory. She stood there watching them cut it down, Mrs. Chen whispered to me. She stood right there with that satisfied look on her face like she was enjoying watching us lose the last connection we had to our boy. Even worse was what had happened to the Petersons, an elderly couple dealing with the devastating progression of Alzheimer's disease. Their golden retriever Buddy had been their constant companion for 7 years, a gentle giant who loved children and had never caused trouble. Buddy was especially important to Eleanor Peterson, whose Alzheimer's had progressed to the point where she recognized very little of her old life, but still lit up with pure joy whenever she saw the dog. But Linda had decided Buddy was too large for the neighborhood and had threatened to fine them $50 a week until they got rid of him. The Petersons had almost given in, terrified of the mounting fines, until their adult daughter hired a lawyer who pointed out that pet size restrictions had to be clearly outlined in the original HOA agreement, not added later through bylaw amendments. She tried to take away the one thing that still makes my wife smile, Harold Peterson told me, his voice breaking with emotion. Eleanor doesn't remember our daughter's name anymore, doesn't remember our 50 years of marriage. But she remembers Buddy. That woman was willing to destroy my wife's last connection to happiness just to prove she had the power to do it. She's turned this place into a prison, whispered Mrs. Henderson, the 73-year-old widow who lived directly behind me. Her husband had died 3 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, and she lived alone now with only her small flower garden for company. Harold and I moved here because we thought it would be peaceful, a place where we could enjoy our retirement. But now I'm afraid to plant anything because I never know what she'll decide is wrong. Last month, she told me my roses were the wrong color for the overall aesthetic vision of the neighborhood. My roses! I've been growing roses for 40 years, and she wants to tell me they're the wrong color. I realized as I listened to story after story that I wasn't just fighting for my tomato plants. I was fighting for everyone who'd been ground down by Linda Patterson's petty tyranny. The woman had taken what should have been a simple community organization and turned it into something that resembled a dictatorship, more than a place where people lived and raised their families. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, held the first Thursday of every month in the community center's multi-purpose room. I had been to plenty of meetings over the years, school board meetings, union meetings, PTA meetings when my own kids were young, and I knew how these things worked. There were rules and procedures, and if you knew those rules better than the people trying to steamroll you, you had a fighting chance. The community center was a bland, beige building that looked like it had been designed by committee. The multi-purpose room was exactly what you'd expect. Harsh fluorescent lights that gave everyone a slightly greenish complexion, uncomfortable metal folding chairs arranged in precise rows, and industrial carpet that had seen better decades. When I walked in at exactly 7 o'clock, I found exactly what I'd expected based on my conversations with neighbors. Linda Patterson sat at the front of the room like a queen holding court, positioned behind a fold-out table, flanked by 2 other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. To her right sat Bob Martinez, a nervous-looking accountant who kept checking his phone and seemed to agree with whatever Linda said without actually listening. To her left sat Janet Wheeler, a mousy woman in her 50s who took meeting minutes and rarely spoke above a whisper. The whole setup screamed of a board that existed to rubber-stamp Linda's decisions rather than provide any real oversight. There were maybe 12 residents scattered around the room, most of them elderly folks who looked uncomfortable and vaguely intimidated. I recognized several of them from my door-to-door conversations, people who'd been fined or threatened. They sat with the resigned posture of people who'd learned that fighting City Hall was usually a losing proposition. Linda ran through the agenda with military precision, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never had her decisions questioned. She discussed budget items that had clearly already been decided, announced policy changes that were presented as done deals, and dismissed the few tentative questions with practiced ease. When I stood up during the open comment period, I could feel Linda's pale blue eyes boring into me like laser beams. The room got quiet in the way that meeting rooms do when everyone senses drama coming. "Ma'am, I'd like to discuss the vegetable garden restriction that's mentioned in Section 4.7 of the current bylaws." "That matter is closed, Mr. Dalton," Linda replied curtly, not even pretending to consider discussion. "The bylaws are clear, and they were properly adopted according to state law. If you have specific questions about compliance with your violation notice, you can schedule an appointment with me during regular office hours." I had expected this response, but I pressed on anyway with the determination of someone who'd spent decades dealing with bureaucratic stonewalling. "Actually, ma'am, I've been doing some research into HOA regulations and state law. According to the state statute governing homeowner associations, any bylaw that restricts food production on private property must be reasonable in scope and cannot constitute a blanket prohibition of all vegetable gardening. A complete ban like the one currently in effect might not be legally enforceable." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on that industrial carpet. Linda's face flushed red, starting from her neck and working its way up like mercury in a thermometer, but her voice remained controlled with the kind of forced calm that suggested she was furious, but trying not to show it. "Mr. Dalton, I appreciate your newfound interest in our community governance, but I think you'll find that our legal counsel has thoroughly reviewed all our regulations for compliance with state and local requirements. If you'd like to challenge our bylaws, you're certainly welcome to hire your own attorney and pursue whatever legal remedies you believe are available to you." It was a clear dismissal, delivered with the confidence of someone who knew that most people couldn't afford to hire lawyers over something as seemingly small as a vegetable garden. But Linda Patterson had badly underestimated me. I'd spent 35 years dealing with school administrators who thought they could intimidate parents and teachers with legal threats and bureaucratic double talk. I spent the entire next week becoming an expert on homeowner association law, diving into legal databases and state regulations with fierce determination. I called the State Attorney General's office and spoke to someone in their Consumer Protection Division who was surprisingly helpful. I researched similar cases online, finding court decisions from around the country where judges had ruled against overly restrictive HOA bylaws. I even contacted a legal aid society that specialized in HOA disputes and spoke to a young lawyer named Maria Santos, who offered to review my case for free and seemed genuinely outraged by what Linda had been doing. What I found gave me hope for the first time since this whole mess started. Several state courts had ruled that blanket vegetable garden bans were unreasonable restrictions on property rights, especially when they weren't based on legitimate community concerns. The key was proving that the restrictions were arbitrary and overly broad, which seemed to describe Linda's bylaw changes perfectly. More importantly, I discovered that Linda had been making changes to the community bylaws without following proper legal procedures required by state law. The state required 30 days written notice to all homeowners before any bylaw amendments could be voted on, but Linda had been sneaking changes through with minimal publicity, burying them in dense legal language in newsletters that most people threw away without reading. I began organizing with the methodical approach of someone who'd spent decades managing complex projects and getting stubborn people to work together. I went door to door again, but this time I wasn't just gathering information. I was building a coalition of neighbors who were ready to stand up and fight back against Linda's tyranny. I created a simple petition asking for a special meeting to review the current bylaws and consider repealing some of Linda's more restrictive amendments. The petition was professional but clear, outlining the legal issues and asking for reasonable modifications that would balance community standards with individual property rights. Within a week, I had signatures from 37 of the 68 homes in Meadowbrook Estates, well over the 25% threshold required by state law for calling a special meeting. More importantly, I had people who were ready to stand up and speak publicly about their experiences with Linda's enforcement tactics. Neighbors who were finally willing to risk her retaliation in order to reclaim their community. Linda was absolutely furious when I presented the petition at the next regular meeting. For the first time since I'd met her, her perfect composure cracked like ice breaking apart in spring, and I saw the real person beneath the polished exterior. Someone who'd built her entire identity around control and couldn't handle being challenged by people she considered beneath her. "This is highly irregular," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch with each word. "These people don't understand the complexity of community governance or the legal liability issues involved in these decisions. They're being manipulated by someone with a personal agenda who doesn't understand what's best for this community." I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 67 years, but also feeling more energized than I had in months. "Ma'am, the only agenda here is following the law. The state requires HOAs to allow reasonable member input on bylaw changes, and calling a special meeting is a basic right that every homeowner in this community possesses. We're not trying to destroy anything. We're trying to make this place somewhere people actually want to live." Linda's face was now bright red, and her carefully maintained hair was starting to come loose from whatever product held it in place. "Mr. Dalton, you've been here for exactly 2 months. These people have trusted me to protect their investment for years. I won't let you destroy what we've built here with your misguided crusade." I looked around the room at my neighbors. People who'd been afraid to plant flowers, afraid to let their children play, afraid to make any changes to their property without permission. "Ma'am, I'm not trying to destroy anything, I'm trying to save it. A community where people are afraid to plant tomatoes in their own backyard isn't a community worth protecting." The special meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and word spread through Meadowbrook Estates like wildfire through dry grass. Linda spent that entire week making frantic phone calls, trying to rally support from her few remaining allies and attempting to intimidate potential opponents with threats of frivolous fines and legal action. She even went so far as to hand-deliver letters to several residents, warning them that attending the meeting could result in increased scrutiny of their properties for code violations. But I had struck a nerve that had been raw for years, and people were tired of being pushed around by someone who seemed to have forgotten that she worked for them, not the other way around. When Thursday night arrived, the community center was packed with over 50 residents, the largest turnout in the HOA's 15-year history. Linda walked into that meeting like she was walking to her own execution. Her usual confident stride was gone, replaced by the stiff, mechanical gait of someone trying to maintain control while everything fell apart around her. She'd brought her lawyer this time, a stern-faced man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and kept checking his watch as if he had somewhere more important to be. I had prepared for this meeting like my life depended on it, which in many ways it did. I'd printed copies of the relevant state regulations for everyone who wanted them. I'd documented Linda's pattern of bylaw changes, showing how she'd systematically expanded her power while reducing residents' rights. I'd prepared a presentation showing how other communities had successfully balanced property values with reasonable regulations. I'd even brought enlarged photos of my garden, showing how neat and well-maintained it was. The meeting started with Linda trying to control the narrative, just like she'd controlled everything else for the past 5 years. She gave a 20-minute speech about property values, community standards, and the dangers of letting outside agitators undermine years of careful planning. She talked about market studies and aesthetic guidelines and the legal liability that could result from relaxing community standards. But when I stood up to respond, you could feel the entire room's energy shift like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. "Mrs. Patterson keeps talking about outside agitators," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "But I'm not an outside agitator. I'm a widower who moved here for peace and quiet after losing my wife of 43 years to cancer. I planted a small garden because it's the only thing that helps me get through each day without her. Mrs. Patterson wants to fine me $50 a week for growing 6 tomato plants in my own backyard. If that makes me an outside agitator, then I guess I'm guilty as charged." The room erupted in murmurs and angry whispers. I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "But this isn't really about my garden, and it's not about property values or community standards. It's about whether we're going to let one person's need for control turn our neighborhood into a place where people are afraid to live their own lives." I began methodically reading from my research, explaining how Linda had changed bylaws without proper notice, how she'd been selective and arbitrary in enforcement, and how many of her restrictions went far beyond what was legally reasonable. With each point I made, more heads nodded in agreement, and Linda's face grew redder. Then came the testimonials, and that's when the dam really burst. Mrs. Henderson stood up with tears in her eyes and talked about being afraid to plant flowers because she never knew what Linda would decide was wrong. The Garcias described the financial stress of being fined for their children's pool, how they'd had to choose between paying Linda's penalty and buying school clothes for their kids. The Chens spoke quietly but powerfully about losing their memorial cherry tree, and how Linda had dismissed their grief as irrelevant to community standards. One by one, Linda's victims found their voices, and the room filled with stories of petty harassment, arbitrary enforcement, and a woman who seemed to take pleasure in making other people's lives difficult. People talked about being afraid to park guests' cars on the street, afraid to hang Christmas decorations that might be deemed inappropriate, afraid to let their children play in their own yards. Linda tried repeatedly to interrupt, to regain control of the meeting, but the crowd was no longer listening to her. Her lawyer whispered urgent warnings in her ear, clearly recognizing that his client had lost not just the room, but probably her position as well. The absolute breaking point came when elderly Mr. Peterson stood up with tears streaming down his weathered face. "My wife Eleanor has Alzheimer's disease," he said, his voice shaking. "She doesn't remember much anymore, but she still lights up when she sees our dog Buddy. Mrs. Patterson tried to have him removed because he was too big. I almost gave up my wife's last source of joy because I was afraid of this woman's threats." The room exploded in outrage, and Linda's face went white as she realized she'd pushed too far. I called for a vote of no confidence in Linda's leadership. The motion was seconded immediately and passed 43-7. Her lawyer advised immediate resignation. Linda stood up slowly, her perfect composure finally cracking completely. "You people have no idea what you're doing," she said, her voice shaking with rage and humiliation. "This community will fall apart without proper leadership. You'll all be sorry you destroyed what we built here." She gathered her papers with trembling hands and walked out, her high heels clicking frantically against the floor like she couldn't escape fast enough. I was elected interim president that night. My first act was suspending all pending fines. Within a week, Linda had put her house on the market and left Meadowbrook Estates forever. The next morning, I planted 3 more tomato plants. Mrs. Henderson asked for help with her herb garden. The Garcias expanded their pool area. The Chens planted a new cherry tree for their son's memory. Under my leadership, We rewrote the bylaws to respect residents' rights while maintaining genuine community standards. That summer, my Cherokee purple tomatoes grew magnificently. I made Margaret's famous salsa and shared it with neighbors who'd become like family. On quiet evenings, I'd sit on my back porch thinking about Margaret and knowing she'd be proud. I'd faced down a bully, saved a community, and found a way to honor my wife's memory. The tomatoes tasted like summer itself, and I knew that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance could grow into the biggest victories.